Afternoon, everyone. This is Deval, and welcome back to our resource adequacy workshop focused on structural elements. Think, if I'm not mistaken, next up is CAISO. Bridgette, looks like you're ready to go. Are you gonna share your screen and the presentation? Was that the plan, or? Can't, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
You are unmuted now. We can hear you.
Let's see if I can get. How do we share again?
So if you're on Teams, right up top, there's a sort of like share content button, looks like an arrow pointed upwards, and you can then just point to your screen. And if you're having difficulty, I'll bring it up.
Yeah.
Why don't I do it, Deval? I'll do the kind of logistics support.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it very much.
We'll bring that up.
Yeah, thank you.
And this is the 10.6 version that I have. Is that correct?
It should say final, I believe, on it.
Okay. Yes. Okay, good. So let me pull that up. Folks, just give me a second here. Where is my Windows? Okay, here it is. Everyone can see that?
Yep. Yes, we can see that.
All right.
Okay, well, while he's pulling that up, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Bridgette Sparks. I'm with our Market and Infrastructure Policy Group. And today we wanted to talk and share the CAISO's perspective on some of our technical limitations that we're sort of filtering through our responses to this program. There was also a question last workshop on the CAISO's openness or willingness to move to seasonal showings. And so we wanted to discuss that a little bit. And then also share a little bit about how we're thinking about implementing and administrating slice of day on our side. So just want to start off that the CAISO supports the objectives of slice of day. So CAISO appreciates the CPUC's recognition that the changing resource mix warrants a revised resource adequacy program that better reflects the energy and capacity needs in all hours of the day. CAISO supports the goal of ensuring that the RA program addresses key operational concerns, such as moving away from gross to net load peak and modifying RA requirements to ensure that both energy and capacity needs are met in all hours. So first, we want to provide an overview of the CAISO's customer interface for resource adequacy, which is our in-house developed application that we use to manage the ISO's resource adequacy program. So again, CIRA is the CAISO application that provides an external user interface to manage the ISO's resource adequacy needs. This program allows scheduling coordinators to submit their annual and monthly supply and RA plans, provides mechanisms to support SCs to perform substitution on RA and CPM for plan enforced outage substitutions, and SCs can submit NQC requests, view NQC reports, and download NQC templates previously submitted. So resource adequacy plans are what identifies the specific resources the load serving entity is relying on to satisfy the forecasted monthly peak. there we go. The forecasted monthly peak demand and reserve margin. And then supply plans verify the information contained in the RA plan submitted by the LSEs, and it establishes the formal RA commitment between the ISO and the resource. So unless a resource is shown on a supply plan, the ISO has no way of recognizing that resource as RA in our systems. And so it's very important for our market applications that we're able to identify which resource IDs are RA or not. And so CIRA is how those other downstream systems are able to identify those resources. So again, CIRA is an in-house developed application, and it is difficult to modify to accommodate new RA structures. So if the CPUC elects to have multiple RA requirements, CIRA is currently only configured to validate a single forecast and reserve margin to validate all LSE's RA plans. So the ISO is currently evaluating the potential impacts of slice of day framework would have on CIRA and other downstream systems, and has concerns about the additional complexity that slice of day may introduce. And so the CAISO is committed to working with parties to ensure that the CPUC and ISO RA programs remain compatible, but also must recognize our own technical constraints that may impede our ability to administer the slice of day framework in its entirety. So we wanted to signal early that the CAISO is still evaluating what our implementation concerns are around slice of day, and wanted to make parties aware that it may not be technically feasible for the ISO to exactly mirror the slice of day framework. However, we think that there are ways that we can keep these programs still compatible, and it may mean that the CAISO doesn't necessarily validate all slices or some sort of variant on that. But as long as all of the resources are shown on RA supply plans, then the ISO can operationalize those in our markets. So one way we've thought about doing this is that the CAISO recommends that CIRA be modified to validate showings at the net load peak. And so the CAISO has observed that most operational challenging periods occur rather than the gross peak as it was when the RA program was initially developed. More and more, we're seeing more operational challenges developing at that net load peak. And so the CAISO recommends that the slice of day framework be structured around meeting forecasted demand and reserve margin at the 8 p.m. hour. And so if the requirements, at least for one of the slices, were set at that 8 p.m. hour, then CIRA could be modified to validate showings against the CEC load forecast plus reserve margin at that 8 p.m. hour as our way of checking for compliance on the ISO side. And the CPUC could still do their own compliance checks to ensure compliance in additional slices. Again, however, the CAISO likely will not validate compliance in these other slices given the limitations of the CIRA application, but we could potentially validate these through an ex post portfolio assessment that we proposed in prior iterations of our RA enhancements initiative on the CAISO side, or some other process we develop in the future once we have greater certainty on what slice of day actually looks like. And so we want to make parties aware that we are committed to working, parties should also work to get all resources shown on RA and supply plans to ensure that the contracted RA can be operationalized in the ISO market. So again, what really matters for the ISO is that these contracted resources are put on supply plans, and then to simplify things and to recognize the greatest operational needs, CAISO is recommending, again, that CIRA be modified to validate the net load peak. However, the CPUC or other entities could have additional requirements in other hours that they would then validate on their end. Next, parties were interested in whether the CAISO would be open to moving to seasonal showing requirements. So currently the CAISO runs its compliance on a monthly basis to match the CPUC's monthly RA requirements. And so if the slice of day framework ends up moving to a seasonal showings, would the CAISO follow suit? And so the CAISO wanted to make folks aware that we do have the ability to move our RA compliance from a monthly to a seasonal requirement, and we would not oppose doing so. However, we wanted to make folks aware of some of the additional difficulties that this may arise. So Again, we want to make parties aware that final compliance would remain at T-30 from the start of that season. So in other words, say we set our season for summer to be June through August. So that showing period would cover 3 months. We would still need to finalize and validate RA plans by May 1st, which is, again, 30 days prior to the start of that June 1 RA period. And those showings would be in effect for the entire 3-month period. So given the expected influx of new resources over the next 5 to 10 years, moving to seasonal showings may increase the risk of new resources that come online mid-season being unable to provide RA until the next seasonal showing. And so it may be more advantageous to maintain monthly showing requirements of the ISO, and then LSCs could show the same resource portfolio they had procured for the CPUC seasonal portfolio and show that same portfolio in each month of that season. So the advantage here is that if you had a resource that would be operational in July under a monthly showing construct, you could still, if there are any delays, it'd be easier to get that resource shown to the CAISO sooner. Whereas if we move to a seasonal requirement, we would be locked in at that T-30 for that entire season. And so again, I think Kathleen mentioned this last workshop that, you know, new resources, the date in which they get are considered operational, if that gets delayed and they miss that final showing deadline of T-30, then it impacts their ability to be RA for a longer portion of time. And so the CAISO thinks it may be more prudent at this time to maintain its monthly showing requirements in order to be able to accommodate this influx of new resource and be able to better capture those resources when they do come online and get them to be considered RA sooner. But again, if most parties think that it'd be simpler to have the CAISO be on a seasonal showing requirements, again, we want to indicate support that we would be willing to move that direction, but just also want to point out some of these potential downsides of moving that way. So in summary, given the limitations of CIRA, the CAISO is committed to working to ensure that the CAISO and CPC RA programs remain compatible, but may not be able to administer slice of day in its entirety on the ISO side. So we think we could accommodate the slice of day framework by validating showings at the net load peak. And so CAISO recommends that CIRA be modified to validate supply and RA plans against the CEC forecast plus reserve margins at the 8 p.m. hour. And again, the CAISO is open to moving RA compliance from a monthly to a seasonal requirement, but this will change compliance timelines for RA showings, and again, may impact the ability of new resources to be considered RA sooner. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
So this is Deval. There are a lot of hands up. I'm just going to go in the sequence that show up on my screen. So first I see Eric Little.
It's Eric Little from CalCCA. Thank you for the presentation. Appreciate it. Just a quick question. So if the ISO were to then move to this net load peak for the measurement, would the ISO be doing any backstop for any other purpose than a deficiency in local and a deficiency in meeting that net load peak?
We would still have things like significant event. So what moving CIRA to validating at the 8 p.m. hour would be, it would only be modifying the system deficiency CPM. So rather than today, when we can CPM off a deficiency identified on that gross load hour, we've been proposing to move that same existing CPM authority to that net load hour. So it wouldn't necessarily be an extension of CPM authority, but rather substituting existing authority that was applied at that gross peak when we validated that, and now we'd be validating at the net load peak and then CPMing based on that. Yeah.
Okay, so let me be a bit more specific. I know the ISO has talked before about doing a portfolio assessment. Is the portfolio capable of meeting your needs at all times? Is that still part of the ISO's thought process? And if so, will the ISO do backstop procurement on that basis?
So that's still an idea we are discussing internally and also in our stakeholder process. So we haven't come to a final conclusion on whether or not we'd be moving forward with a portfolio assessment and what that would mean for CPM. It's still an idea we're interested in discussing further, but we haven't made a firm decision one way or the other. And I think we're wanting to see how slice of day shapes up and what changes may need to be made on the CAISO side. So our efforts are more so focused on this workshop. And then what we do down the road in terms of whether or not we do a portfolio assessment is still being discussed and will be stakeholdered in our enhancements initiative.
Okay, thank you, Bridgette. Appreciate it.
Next is Chris Devon.
From Customized Energy Solutions. Just had a couple bits of feedback to consider. First off, I guess on the seasonal versus monthly thing, I can see why CAISO is trying to, state that there's an important aspect of this where we're getting into new resources and that sort of thing. But I guess that just seems to be really the only downfall of potentially moving to season that's really being presented. So I just wanted to point out the fact that the planned outage process enhancements that need to be made, that need to be considered, have not been addressed by the CAISO sufficiently over the last 3 years. They've been talking about it, and I think that piece of it is really what would be beneficial on the whole idea of moving to more of a seasonal construct, because it just allows you to have more flexibility to allow those planned outages without having these onerous planned outage substitution requirements that are now in place. So I really think that should be part of the discussion here as well in this RA framework. And then the other thing is just that this kind of limitations that Kais was pointing out about the SIRA system. I certainly understand the need to want to avoid making major changes, but I really would just suggest it seems like it's a bit obstructionist to just say we can't be changing SIRA when we need to really be thinking about this RA reform as something that probably should change the way that CAISO does things quite a bit as well. So that's just a high level bit of feedback here. I won't take more time or dive into it more, but I just wanted to provide those couple pieces of feedback on this presentation. Thanks, Bridgette.
Okay. Next is Nuo Tang.
Hey, this is Noah Tong from Middle River Power. Yeah, just a little bit on following up on what Chris said. I'm trying to better understand sort of the limitations on whether or not the ISO, if it's an internal sort of coding issue or something else that they can make changes and add more requirements. The currently SIRA both validates for system, but also flex and local requirements at the same time, right? Is it possible? So if you think of peak requirements as one slice, is it possible or not possible for the ISO to add sort of 5 more requirements as the additional slices that sort of PG&E is proposing?
So it's not so much that SIRA can't necessarily be eventually developed to validate 5 slices. I think more fundamentally where the CAISO is still thinking through the potential implications are, what does this mean for things like CPM? Are you only CPM for a slice? What does this mean for a MU? If you're shown in this slice, do you only have a must offer obligation in that slice? And so I think it's not necessarily just SIRA that could be impacted by these changes, but when you say the resources RA for this slice, what are the implications for these other processes that the CAISO runs? And so when you start kind of pulling at the threads of what does it need to be RA in these different applications, such as, CPM, we haven't gotten into resource counting, but depending on how that is done, what is the value of that resource? And so how does that impact the way we do bid insertion? The must offer obligation, right now it's 24/7 because that's the way RA is defined. If we redefine RA around these slices, it could limit the CAISO's ability to make the argument that you should be having a must offer obligation for 24/7. And when you start pulling at those threads, I think we start to have more reliability concerns because, again, slice of day is about a typical day. But when it comes to operationalizing it, we know we have all these uncertainties that may materialize. And so if we get too narrowly, granularly focused, it may impede the CAISO's ability to do least cost dispatch, to optimize use limited resources, to produce power or produce energy in the best hours based on those market results of that hour, rather than sort of what did LSEs happen to procure up front. And so when we talk about CIRA, it's not just the CIRA application itself, but it's also all these downstream implications around once this resource is designated as RA in the CIRA system, what does that mean for all these other downstream systems and how we should be treating them in the market? And so we're internally still kind of discussing what this all means, but just wanted to kind of flag it here early that, one pathway that we could do is that the CAISO continues to sort of do a simple validation, because again, as long as you're determined RA in our systems, then the markets can optimize you. And so do we need to have all these additional complexities in perfectly matching slice of day if at the end of the day they still have a 24/7 obligation? Do we need to administer all this complexity on the ISO end, or is there ways to simplify it? And so right now we think, wanting to kind of push parties and thinking about, like, are there ways we can simplify this and to sort of plant the seed that maybe the CAISO doesn't have to be the one to administer all the complexity, and we can find ways to make sure that what the CPUC is validating against their compliance program, how does that then get matched and merged with the CAISO process so that these are all working in concert, but that the ISO doesn't necessarily have to go through and validate all 5 slices, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I can understand and appreciate sort of the complexity as we build more of it into this program and the ISO systems. I just think that a lot of that has to do with we haven't sort of pinned down the options that are in front of us yet. And sort of in my thinking, for one of your responses, is that I don't think I've seen, or at least I think I've seen PG&E back off from its a slice-specific move to a 24-hour move. So if we make those assumptions, we might get to a different outcome, and in what the ISO is capable of helping in achieving these goals to ensure reliability in the new framework. I kind of feel like this is very much of a Sudoku puzzle right now, that we're all trying to figure out which number goes into which box, and that's all depending on another one. And then what your side on the validating against the net load peak and the operating reserve, or sorry, the PRM around that. I'm wondering what you then expect on sort of the must offer obligations for wind and solar resources. Do you still would you still expect those to be coming into the ISO, into CIRA, to, I guess, match up against the gross load?
Mm-hmm. I think that kind of question also kind of depends on how we do the resource counting for wind and solar. So I think under this framework, we were still imagining they would have an ELCC value at the 8 p.m. hour. And so we'd want to potentially increase the PRM during the 8 p.m. hour to recognize that solar probably doesn't have any generating capability. And so it may be that when we validate something like, a reserve margin of 17.5%, say, or some other additional percentage to cover the fact that the shown solar we know doesn't have hardly any generating capability in this 8 p.m. hour. And so, we have other resources to replace it to maintain that 15% planning reserve margin that we have in other hours when solar is producing.
Yeah. So I guess sort of if you take the net load peak, the net load peak hour and net of both wind and solar, then the operating reserves that are part of the PRM, may tend to be sort of a lower reserve value rather than one that's based off gross load. So it's something that for you to think about, right? Instead of take, the operating 6% of 12,000 megawatts, you're only looking for 12,000, or sorry, 6% of 10,000 megawatts because of the net load. You're actually just shorting yourself out of operating reserve of 2,000.
Hey, no, this is Deval. I'm gonna intervene here. This is meant to be some, brief Q&A. I mean, we can have ad nauseum debates on, what is the right answer. I mean, that's not the purpose. I think to the extent both, I mean, not just you, but other questioners have specific questions, I certainly welcome that. But let's try not to make this into a back and forth debate, please.
Well, hopefully I wasn't debating. I was just trying to get some discussion going. I apologize if you felt that I was debating.
No, it's just, I mean, I also want to be mindful of everyone's time, time allotment, and then also, rest of the agenda. So that I mean, I just got a sense that maybe there's a point to just kind of move on. Unless there was a question. I mean, I did not mean to stop you abruptly, but and my comment applies to others as well, please.
Yeah, so I was trying to get clarifications from Bridgette and to get a better understanding of the ISO's thinking into these slides, and just a little bit of feedback and discussion. I thought that would be helpful.
Sure. Okay, anything else from you? If not, next is Kathleen Colbert.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
No, great, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks, Bridgette, so much for going through this and for kind of flagging that I had mentioned our concern about the new resources being kind of blocked out of providing RA for a longer period of time under a seasonal. I did want to kind of maybe just throw out two things and ask you, ask for the CAISO maybe as the next step. So I wanted to flag that we really do think that is a serious concern, especially because we're on the short resource adequacy condition that we are in today, and procurement is such a focus over the next few years until 2026. And even if this gets implemented in 2024, like, we believe that having resources with a MOO, with an obligation as quickly as possible is what supports reliability. If that, and just to kind of note for another functionality to CPM impact, is that if you locked, so if you had the seasonal, and as you mentioned, let's say it started in June, so the first initial showing would be mid-April, and then the CERA would be locked at T-30 at beginning of May. But if you, at that point, if after that revision deadline, the new resource achieves their net qualifying capacity, while we would be blocked out of participating in a formal resource adequacy contract under the CPUC, we would not be blocked from the CAISO's capacity procurement mechanism. So I know people have a lot of opinions about this. I'm not trying to put a pro or con. I just did want to emphasize that another ripple effect is that for those new resources that come online during a season, if they're not able to be updated within the season on the RA plan, but the system needs them for reliability, that the CAISO can still procure us under CPM, but that would be under a different cost allocation approach. And as I mentioned, there's, that is not our preferred route to achieving a capacity obligation. Executing the RA contracts under this program is preferred, as I think most share that opinion. But I wanted to note that so we didn't lose sight that is an inefficiency. Thank you. And I ask the CAISO to think about that more. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Next is Grant McDaniel.
Yeah, thank you. This is Grant McDaniel with Wellhead. So just a couple of quick things. One, Chris mentioned something about the seasonal construct being able to help with outage planning. I'd love to understand that a little bit more. I didn't quite get why that was the case. Chris maybe could bring that out. But in terms of the ability, I think that we're going to buyers and sellers here are going to have to be able to transact by the slice. And if I transact by the slice, then I think your must offer obligation is going to have to be by the slice. Yeah, right, if I didn't sell the entire 24-hour period. And that brings me to the third thing, which is, has CAISO thought about outage substitution? What are you going to need for, an outage, for a resource to take an outage and be able to substitute? Do I have to have all the slices, just 3 of the slices, and, it's just something that we need to make sure that we cover in these discussions. So that's it.
Thanks. Yeah, just real quick. I think the planned outage process enhancement that going to a seasonal showings might give you, that Chris was referring to, is in prior iterations, CAISO had thought about including something like a planning reserve margin, or what we ended up implementing was you have to have a resources substitute with your resource if you want to take a planned outage, regardless of how much RA headroom there is. And so if we had moved to seasonal showing, and part of the logic behind that is because with a monthly construct, the requirements are more exact. And so there isn't as much, variation in the day-to-day showings that you could reasonably expect to have excess headroom to then approve that planned outage. Under seasonal requirements, we know June is usually lower than, say, July or August. And so in June, there would probably likely be more RA headroom. And so instead of having to have substitutions up front, you could look to see, for that forecast, how much headroom is left over, and could you then accommodate that planned outage, because we have other resources on the system to cover the needs. And so moving to seasonal requirements, the CAISO could consider revising its policy of how we do planned outage substitution to do more of this, kind of validating against the RA headroom in the season. So that's one thing we could consider that seasonal might get you.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Bridget. The only thing I would say is, when we do consider that, we do have to make sure that resources have a way to ensure that they can take the planned outages they need every year. And the problem with we'll see if we can approve it, is that you don't know that there's an absolute way for you to get to the finish line. So just a thought to remember. Thank you again.
Yep, agreed. Thank you.
And next I see is Jamie Gannon.
Hi, I'm Jamie Gannon with Energy Division. Thanks for the presentation, Bridgette. And I guess I want to be brief because I think my point has already, or my question or point has been hit on by Chris and Kathleen. But I think putting this barrier up on the T-30 limitation of getting new resources included in the seasonal showing will have a huge impact on the overall structure if the CAISO proposes that barrier and doesn't maybe refine its SIRA system to make it more flexible to allow for those resources to count. I know in the year ahead space, CAISO does allow for resources under construction to count towards meeting local requirements. I think they have to meet a COD date of June 1 in order to be eligible. And so I guess my question back to you is, why is this such a strong barrier? Especially as Kathleen brings up, the CAISO does CPM these resources as soon as they reach COD. And I know for a fact we have, authorized about 6,000 megawatts to come online August 1, 2026. And some of those resources won't have NQC values. And we would be requiring these resources to essentially come online 120, 160 days prior to that date, essentially not counting a huge chunk of the capacity that we're bringing online towards, these requirements that we actually need to show up to be reliable. So can you just put a little bit more of, I guess, kind of the thought that went into that barrier and why that's such a strong barrier that, you're holding to?
Right. So a lot of this is coming from, or rather what we've heard from our legal team is that we have to have some firm deadlines in order to say, yes, you're RA or no, you're not RA. And so we have to have some sort of upfront validation that, like, right now you're RA, and we also know that resources get delayed. And so I think our concern is what happens when we get into a situation where we may have counted a resource and then that project gets delayed and it's not actually operational by, you know, June 1 or the start of that RA period. And so I think our concern is really in that sort of negative case of what if we count a resource and it doesn't actually become operational? What do we do? Versus at some point you have to, you know, close the door and say yes, you're RA, or no, you're not RA, so that we can run our other processes such as CPM, and so that our operators have confidence that we have, you know, upfront secured resources to cover the operational period. So, you know, I know this is an issue that's come up several times, and so we're always happy to continue to dialogue on this. But you know, at some point we have to say yes, you're RA, or no, you're not RA, and then, you know, CPM is sort of a safety valve to kind of capture, you know, resources that happen to miss what we had expected of them. But I think if you get too lax on these, you know, you do potentially run into reliability risks. And so, you know, we're happy to follow up with you and parties to kind of explain this a little bit more in depth about sort of why we need to have something like a T-30 deadline to determine what's RA and what's not RA.
Yep, thanks for that, Bridgette. And I guess I encourage you to think about the year ahead space as it comes to local. I think, you know, you don't consider you do consider resources under construction in that process to determine a CPM in the annual space, and maybe something like that could be considered in a more seasonal approach, because we'd be looking out further. So I encourage you to look at that. Otherwise, I think it could have consequences on the amount of procurement we're bringing online in 2024 if the program is implemented by then. I also just want to point out that I know while the CAISO doesn't, you know, you made the point that the CAISO, you know, wants to kind of keep it simple and doesn't want to move to multiple requirements. Just want to make the point that, you know, our current program today is similar in that the CPUC has MCC bucket requirements, and CAISO doesn't implement them, but the CPUC does. However, you know, they're not binding in that there's not really like an EFC list that determines your bucket, right? And so when we measure compliance, it's based upon what the LSEs are telling us the bucket is, and for the most part, the other clarifications that have been given in the RA guide. However, you know, I think we're trying to move, and those MCC buckets are really trying to capture use limitations of each resource. And so we're trying to move forward and make something like that, a construct like that binding, you know, and we'll get into that into like the counting world. But, you know, to the degree that the CAISO, you know, can help us to facilitate that and make that program more binding, and then utilize that in its portfolio assessment analysis if it does one, so that we stay aligned, that would be, you know, the ideal kind of, in my mind, you know, framework of you know, coordination between, you know, CPUCs and CAISO's processes. Thank you. I won't take any more time.
All right, thank you. I don't see any other hands up, so thank you, Bridgette, for taking the time, and we can move to our next agenda item, which is SCE presenting its 24-hour slice proposal. I believe you know, Jeff Nelson and Josh Copenhaver are going to tag team, but Jeff, can you kick it off?
Sure, trying to get everything done here. You should be able to see. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to present. Jeff Nelson and Josh Copenhaver from SCE. Can everyone see the 24-hour slice presentation on their screens?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, well, with that, thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Josh, and Josh, take it away, and we're going to tag team.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. I'm excited to be presenting at the 1 o'clock hour because I can't see anyone's faces, but I assume everyone's settling in for their afternoon nap, and we'll have limited questions. But just to put up front, I think we're going to try to defer any clarifying questions till around slide 5, and we'll try to defer more discussion until towards the end of the presentation. So my name is Josh Copenaver. I am a Director of Portfolio Planning and Analysis. I work within SCE's Energy Procurement Team, and I'm here presenting with Jeff Nelson, who's Director of FERC Rates and Market Integration, and he works within our Regulatory Affairs team. So appreciate the opportunity to present this framework to you. Just a quick caveat up front. This is not a formal SCE proposal. This is really a straw man of a framework that we have been exploring internally, and we think there's a lot to like about it, and so we want to share it here to the broader stakeholder universe, and we think it's something that deserves further consideration in this process. So appreciate everybody's interest today. So first off, I think we're going to try to cover 3 basic things in this presentation. First, we'll give you the basic framework and resource counting, that at least how we're thinking about it today. Second, we've done a little bit of analysis trying to compare an hourly approach versus 4-hour slices, or really versus any slice of day approach that's takes slices longer than 1 hour, and we'll kind of present to you our findings. And then third, we want to talk about what a showing might look like. I know folks might have concerns when we say 24 hours, but we want to basically demonstrate that we think this is administratively feasible. So, and then finally, we'll come back with our observations on this approach. So Jeff, can you move to the next slide? So I should say, we've been exploring a 24 hourly slice monthly showing framework. So just to be crystal clear, this is a single showing per month, demonstrating that an LSC's portfolio of resources could meet its load profile plus PRM on the worst day of each month. In this framework, we consider each hour of this worst day a slice. And a couple other important aspects is hourly renewable capacity would be based on renewable capacity based on an hourly profile for each LSC's unique renewable portfolio. And resources would have full capability must offer requirement. So in the framework that we've been exploring, there's no unbundling of single slice capacity products. Resources will still be subject to the existing sort of must offer obligation, and slices cannot be unbundled. So what is the rationale, or what led us to explore this approach? And it's really a couple factors. And we're going to talk about more about these in later slides. But first, and this really ties back to PG&E's presentation early in the morning. Our observation is that load and renewable supply vary dramatically hour to hour. And if you look across months or seasons, this is even more true. In fact, when we look at seasons, things like hydro availability also come into play. And we also observe that we believe that this relationship between load and renewables is going to evolve over time. So it's not going to be consistent. So as we have more renewables, more solar, more wind on the grid, it's going to lead to changing profiles or relationships. Second is our analysis suggests that increasing the size of slices can lead to inefficiencies. And this really has 2 flavors, and it's first is the larger the slice, the more renewable output is penalized. And this, if you could think about it, like it might be easy to think about from like a seasonal perspective. Your solar profile in October is going to be very different in June. And you're going to set requirements ultimately on, what's likely the worst day in a season. That leads to a situation where you're penalizing renewable output. Second issue really has to do with use limitations. And 2 observations is that use